Yeah. personal nature will not be asked. We may consolidate questions on the same general topic. And finally, all questions submitted are the property of League of Women Voters Minneapolis. For the candidate's opening statement, we ask that they address the question, why are you running for Minneapolis School Board and what are your qualifications? You'll each have up to 2 minutes to respond. The speaking order for this question was determined by drawing numbers prior to the forum. And the first candidate to speak is Lisa Shefty.
And do I introduce myself too?
Yes, please introduce yourself. And then the question is, why are you running for Minneapolis School Board and what are your qualifications?
Hello, ahau buju. My name is Lisa Shefty. I'm from the Red Lake Nation of Anishinaabe. I'm a citizen there, but I grew up here in Minneapolis in a little community like many people might know. It's on the south side of Minneapolis. It's called Little Earth of United Tribes. It is not a tribe. It is a low-income housing complex for Native people. I graduated from South High Minneapolis, and I attended the University of Minnesota for undergrad, and I'm almost done with my master's in public health. Why am I running? I'm running because folks in my community called upon me, and when our community calls upon you, you answer and you show up. And also because I have a niece and a nephew who attend Minneapolis public schools, and I care about what they learn, how they're learning it, what they have access to, and what their opportunities are. And I know firsthand I know from firsthand that I have a lot of experience, good experiences in Minneapolis public schools, and I also had a lot of learning experiences. And what makes me qualified? I think I'm qualified because I live in Minneapolis, South Minneapolis. I've always lived here. I've worked within my local Native community on health topics, education, involvement with the schools. But also I think it's because I have a really strong background in equity and system change, and I have worked with groups of people on how to look at policies and practices and how to make real changes. Thank you, miigwech.
Sonia Emmerich.
Hi, can you all hear me? My name is Sonia Emmerich. I am a lifelong Minneapolis resident. I am a graduate of Minneapolis Public Schools. Like Lisa, I also graduated from South High, and I am a parent in the district. My 7-year-old has complex disabilities and has been receiving special education services through MPS since he was 2 years old, and he receives now his extensive services homebound, except he doesn't actually. He has extensive services written into his IEP. Last year I attended 40 hours of IEP meetings, 24 of them either facilitated or mediated by the Minnesota Department of Education, and he's still not getting his services that are in his IEP delivered. He's now missed almost 1.5 years of his education. I have navigated that special education system now for a number of years. I'm also a poor person and a systems-involved disabled person myself. So I've been navigating county systems involvement, public housing systems, Medicaid systems, home and community service systems my entire adult life. And a lot of families in Minneapolis public schools are also very familiar with navigating these types of systems. I think that expertise in systems navigation is really important when we think about who is kind of going to be working on creating more culturally sustaining family engagement, better partnership with our communities, and better understanding of what's needed to repair relationships among stakeholder groups in Minneapolis public schools. So I'm very passionate about equity, I'm very passionate about culturally sustaining engagement, and I'm very passionate about all our kids getting a great education.
Laurel Myra.
Hello. Sorry, my light's not on, so I didn't think wasn't sure I was on. So I'm Laurel Myra. I am an enrolled member of the Red Lake Nation. I grew up in Red Lake. I've lived most of my adult life in Minneapolis, in surrounding areas. So I did live in Stillwater for a brief 10 years and moved back about nearly 3 years ago now to Minneapolis. So really excited to have this opportunity. I do have two children, a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old, and have had some both positive and negative experiences in Minneapolis Public Schools, but I spent 2 years on the American Indian Parent Advisory Council and had an opportunity to make a difference there and really learn about what is going on in the district. And I definitely, some of my experience, so that's why I ran, or why I'm running, and some of the qualifications, I do have about 7 years of experience in directorship roles, and more than that, about 14, 15 years of management and running both racial equity committees and also heading up challenging budgets and being able to bring those bring fundraising opportunities in. I have a doctorate in family social science and marriage and family therapy, and I also just am very passionate about children's mental health, and those are some of the reasons that I think I would be a good candidate.
Thank you. Now we move to the questions from the live audience and those that were submitted in advance to the league email. Speaking order will rotate. Candidates will have up to 1 1/2 minutes to answer these questions, and we will begin with Laurel. And the question is, one of the first tasks of the next Minneapolis School Board will be to recruit and hire a new superintendent. How would you ensure that someone is selected that will provide strong and effective leadership and address community concerns?
Thank you. Great question. So part of my time on APAC, I did have a lot of opportunities to interact with Ed Graff and be able to share concerns from the community. One of the things that I think is going to be really important is to have somebody who, both has a strong business and systemic racism lens coming in, because I think it's really hard to hit the ground running and make the changes that need to be made if they don't have that experience and it needs to be taught on the job. So I think that's going to be crucial. And also looking at some of the process put in place to hire and retain. I do think that being able to have an active voice in making sure that the person has a strong background in business as well, so that we're able to identify some solutions financially for the board and for the district as well, I think is going to be very important. Thank you.
Thank you. And I do want to add for candidates, if at any time you need me to reread a question, please ask. Next is Sonia Emmerich.
Yeah, so what is important to me in terms of the characteristics of a new superintendent would be someone who has the will and the leadership to carry out the strategic plan that MPS has developed. MPS has spent time developing a strategic plan. We are at the earliest stages of implementation currently, and part of that plan is conditions that have to exist, that have been identified by leadership and approved by the current board. What we need to be seeing in order for there to be success in the goals that are part of our strategic plan. So what would be important to me is to look at what we've already identified we need in terms of leadership, and then ensure that we are finding someone who has the will and the leadership to implement what we've already identified we need. What I hope won't happen is that we will bend on our criteria based on the candidates who are available, because I think it's very important right now that we stabilize our district by staying the course that we've already determined. And so finding a superintendent that fits well, that can lead, and that can work with all partners to carry out that plan is what would be the highest priority to me.
Lisa Shefty.
So I agree a lot with Laurel and Sonia. I also think that someone who lives in Minneapolis is really important. I think it's really important for them to know the schools in which they represent. Having some classroom time or experience in Minneapolis public schools, I think, is important. Also, I think that I would love for them to be a BIPOC person, potentially, because then I feel like they have the experience. They would have had the experience of knowing what it's like to recruit, retain, and have some real personal experience with that, and also in a position of leadership. I also a lot of the strategic plan has already been developed, and I think that someone who has a strong racial justice background is definitely imperative. And yeah, thank you.
The next question will go to Sonia Emmerich first. The school board is responsible for the budget of the district. Given that there will be a need to establish budget priorities, what would be your top priorities for funding within the district?
Could you please clarify in the question whether when you say top priorities for funding, you're describing top priorities to fund, or top priorities in terms of procuring funding?
I think you could answer the question either way. I think this question is meant to specifically deal with the budget and funding line items in the budget for funding the district.
Okay, thank you. So I think a lot about how we can, I've parented in poverty for 20 years. So I think a lot about how we can get creative in terms of using the resources that we have available to us to best meet the needs of our students and keep our districts functioning. And I can come up with and described a lot of solutions in terms of being better intergovernmentally partnered, in terms of better using community resources to make our students' educational experiences richer. But I do believe that there is not a long-term sustainable solution to the very real budget crisis that we find ourselves in without having state investment. So organizing and lobbying for investment from the Minnesota legislature is going to be incredibly important when we think about the ideal conditions that we hope to offer in our district long term. So we need to do well with what we have, but it's not enough on its own.
Lisa Shefty.
Yeah, I agree. Lobbying and getting more state funding for our schools. And also, I love that. I love that idea of using the resources we already have. And I myself utilize a lot of community resources for the kids in my family, but also I grew up, my mom accessed every sort of program that was available. And we have a lot of community partners that have really great relationships with the schools. And I think continued investment in those community programs, because sometimes they have solutions. They're working with families who might not be able to be at the table. And so those voices that we're not hearing, I think, but I think that there's a lot of resources that, and partners that we might not know about because we don't have that skill or we can't reach those communities in a good community engagement effort. And then also, I think with budget, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the fact that like there is not enough money, and we need to make sure that we're prioritizing and picking something that we're going to work on together, and we cannot leave out Black or Brown and Native people in those budget decisions.
Laurel Myra.
I think what comes to mind for me most is just the need for fundraising. In conversations that I've had over the last couple of years about the budget, it has been very bleak and not a lot of conversation that's creative or thinking outside of the box. And I think that that is going to be something that's imperative in order to close the gap in funding. I also agree that advocating for state and federal funding is going to be very important. I think, you know, one of the things that has recently been on my mind about the funding has been a recent book that has come out around dyslexia, and my daughter has been recently diagnosed with dyslexia, and just the number of the high rates of dyslexia in prisons. And I think about how hard it was for me with a person with a doctorate to navigate the system and be able to get my daughter the testing she needed to find out that she had dyslexia, and the cost that, you know, a lot of people can't afford to pay, and just the high rates that are in the prison, and the fact that we're spending dollars in prisons to get people tested. I mean, I think that's great that that's available, but I think we need to make sure that funding is moved down to the younger children so that we can make a bigger impact in people's lives.
Thank you. This next question will go to Laurel Myra first. We know that English language learning and special education are severely underfunded. What are some solutions you see the district exploring to ensure that these programs get the funding they need?
So I kind of mentioned this already, but advocating for state and federal funds, because we do have a surplus that's pretty significant every year in the state. Being able to utilize some of those dollars for special education and English language learners, I think would be really, makes a lot of sense, I think, to a lot of people. And I think bringing more advocacy efforts in that direction would be probably one of my priorities. But I also think accessing funds that haven't been tapped into yet. And I think that there's a lot of agencies that are out there that haven't had the opportunity to partner with Minneapolis Public Schools, and not just for services, but also for things like work preparation, or just even funding, and getting more of a stronger relationship with the schools, I think, is something that hasn't really been explored to the extent it really should be. So if that's something that I would really work on.
Sonia Emmerich.
Yeah, you know, this is a one that's really near and dear to me, and you know, when we think about bringing diverse perspectives to the table, I think something that, you know, is one of those diverse perspectives is, as a disabled adult who has a cultural identity around disability and is involved in disability justice organizing, one of the critiques that we hear from that community a lot of the time is, why do we want to fund more special education? Because it's segregation, and why do we want to fund more segregation for our students, for our kids, right? And so I'm not saying that I agree that we shouldn't fund it, but I'm saying when we think about the lenses that we are not even starting to consider when we think about special education, you know, when we think about, for instance, 1 in 36 Minnesotans is autistic, right? That means 1 in 36 adults is autistic in Minnesota. Why don't we have autistic adults as a stakeholder group helping us figure out how to better serve autistic students? Where do we see that we don't do better when we have representation from the adults in a culture when figuring out how to better serve students of that culture? And it's because we haven't even yet gotten to the place where we consider disability a viable and valuable culture. We still see it as something that's broken. So when we think about what needs to happen around special education particularly, you know, we haven't even gotten to the point where we see it as a culture that needs to be served sustainably, just like all of the cultures in our district need to be served in a culturally sustaining way.
Wow.
I love you too.
I know, she is so good. Okay, so yeah, ditto. And also, I use, I feel like I say the same things over and over, so I apologize for it. But I use a racial justice equity tool in almost everything I do. And the first question in AREA is asking, who are we talking about? And it's asking a lot of those questions like, who are we talking about? Have they been engaged in this process? When did we start working with them? The racial justice tool I use a lot is from Voices for Racial Justice, by the way. It's free, it's available online. I love community resources because there's so many of them and they're available. And if you use a tool like the RIA, it forces folks in the room to have a more deeper conversation that they might not have had, where we're talking about, are the folks who are the most impacted, are they a part of this decision? What is the decision? What is the disparity we're trying to address? Is it sustainable? These are all the questions in AREA. My favorite, though, to explore and to think about is what potential negative impacts might this decision have? And it forces everyone at the table to have a critical conversation about the good intentions their policy practice might have. Thank you.
All right, this next question will go to you first, Lisa. Teachers in this district went on strike for 3 weeks last spring. How would you approach teacher pay, benefits, class sizes, and recruitment and retention efforts in your relationship with the teachers union differently going forward, if at all?
We need to value our teachers. They are so important to they're the most important, right, in the classroom. I got a story because I'm a storyteller. My nephew, when he was in kindergarten, he was so excited. He said, "Auntie, my teacher is an elder." And I was like, "Oh," and I go into his classroom and she had family members come and read a book. And so I go, and I'm all excited, and there's 27 kids in the class. And my nephew said to me, he said, "Do you know that," or he was like, "This is what it would be like if you had 27 kids, but you know my teacher, she's an elder, she can do this." And I was like so impressed, but also so fearful because I was just like, what if who in this classroom might be getting missed? Because in a group that big, we can't identify if someone has extra needs or needs extra attention, or if they're not, or if they need more aid. And so I think that with the teachers, like, we got to support them and we got to hear what they're asking for, and we have to do anything we can to make sure that they have what they need to be successful.
Laurel Myra.
Can you please repeat the question?
I can. Teachers in this district went on strike for 3 weeks last spring. How would you approach teacher pay, benefits, class sizes, and recruitment and retention efforts in your relationship with the teachers union differently going forward, if at all?
Well, I definitely think, there's been a break in trust is kind of what I hear and understand during that period. Not to say that, the fact that things had to get to that point in order for change to happen, I think is problematic. So more of a proactive approach I would take to, I think the issue that that you listed that is probably closest to my heart and I'm most interested in addressing is identifying and retaining teachers of color because it is so important to close the education gap. There's just not enough that's been done, and I think there's a lot of room for creativity, and just really excited to offer my expertise in those areas.
Thank you. And Sonia, before you answer the question, I want to make sure that you're leaning close enough to the microphone. I've got reports that there's some trouble picking up sound. I think it might have adjusted recently, but it's your turn.
Yeah, I saw a tweet by a veteran teacher, nobody in our district recently. Can y'all hear me?
No.
Okay. No?
Not well.
Okay, hold on. What about now? Hey, now we're cooking with grease. Okay. I heard, so there was a tweet by a veteran teacher, not someone in our district, but that I read recently, and it said, one of the most effective classroom management strategies that I have ever used is slowing everything down. Right? And so I think about the folks who are in our school buildings during the day, our students, our educators, our administrative site-based staff, right? And I think about how much trauma everyone is holding right now, and that we know that trauma is experienced in the body as too much, too soon, too fast. And we know that in order to be present and available to reliably learn, our students need to be not experiencing active trauma. And we know that in order to be able to slow down enough to understand embodied experience of internal bias that would cause harm to marginalized students, our teachers need to not be experiencing active trauma. So in terms of, you know, all of the different issues that were a part of that question that I don't know how to address in 90 seconds, what I think about is what are we needing in order for our educators to be able to slow down enough to not hurt our students, to not be harmed themselves, and to be able to be available to the learning conditions that students need.
Thank you. The next question will go to Sonia Emmerich first. Minneapolis public schools continue to have a significant ongoing disparity in academic milestones between children of color and white children. If elected, what are your goals during your term to improve academic outcomes, particularly for students of color and Indigenous students?
Yeah, so I kind of think about three different broad categories when I think about this question. One of them is our instructional practices, right? We need to have instructional practices around literacy and numeracy that are efficacious, evidence-based, that we know align with how we know about how most kids learn. Another of sort of the categories is about cultural sustainability, right? We have to make sure that we have educators that mirror our students experientially, culturally, right? I had the opportunity for my kid to have an autistic teacher over the summer, and he made so much more progress because she just understood him. You know, it's not that teachers who aren't autistic are bad teachers, but there's just something about that experience relationship that's so effective for our students. And then I think of structural issues. I think of, you know, transportation. I think of making sure that all of our students have equitable access to even being in the classroom. I think about how we need to interrupt the overuse and inequitable use of exclusionary discipline, right? Because when you're taking kids out of their classroom, they can't be present for learning, but also when you're teaching your kids that they don't belong in their classrooms, that there's something wrong with them that makes them not belong in their classrooms, you're also interrupting their construction of a self-concept as a scholar, right? And belonging in a learning community. So I think there's a lot of different places where we need to be intervening. One solution is not going to solve the issue because it's a very structural and systemic issue.
Lisa Shefty.
Yeah, it is. I definitely believe that it's a structural and systemic issue. And I think that the school system might, like all systems, like I worked in healthcare, some folks will take poverty issues or as social economic issues, and they'll bucket them as different or over here. And schools will say we can only focus on right now and here, but we have to start looking at the intersectionality of like how our students are impacted. But also every single question you asked, every single question that was asked even today, they all are woven in to how, to this exact issue of closing the disparity gap for our students. And it goes back to representation matters. I was in 9th grade before I had my first Black teacher, 11th grade before I had my first Native teacher, and he taught American history, and the book he taught gave they teach it in college, and it's one of the most, but I remember this, right? Because it's significant. It's the first time I heard about American Indian history in a classroom, in a real way. It was just it was just Indigenous Peoples Day, and I gotta stop. But if you want me to finish that story, I'll tell you later.
Laurel Myra.
And I'm sorry, I just really got into this, so I needed the question repeated.
She may want to hear your story later.
She hears all my stories, actually.
Minneapolis public schools continue to have a significant ongoing disparity in academic milestones between children of color and white children. If elected, what are your goals during your term to improve academic outcomes, particularly for students of color and Indigenous students?
Well, I kind of mentioned earlier, the importance of teachers of color, and I appreciate the story that Lisa's sharing. I also have many stories of my own about, I grew up in northern Minnesota, and the teachers had a lot of unconscious bias, and what looking back on was very outward, aggressive racism of saying things like, Native kids are stupid, they can't learn in front of the classroom. Granted, I went off reservation for schools, so I was like one of 3 other kids, and I knew this wasn't true, but luckily I had a strong support system of people who advocated and said, this is not okay, and I was able to see a change in the school system. And I think that was my mom, seeing my mom advocate the way she did, and the changes that came about really have impacted me to say, okay, we need to ask for more. It's never going to be enough. When I was on the APAC committee as vice chair, we had to vote each year about whether we agreed that enough was being done, and I was always the outlier who was voting no, not enough is being done. A lot is being done, but it's not enough. It's not going to be enough until we actually see these gaps closed. Thanks.
Thank you. The next question will go to Laurel Myra first. How can the Minneapolis School Board help address the mental health issues of students?
So this is an area that I'm really passionate about as well, as a mental health provider for many years. And I currently direct a program, and I hired a director to direct the program, but I also get to be largely a part of it, is a pediatric mental health program in Minneapolis, in South Minneapolis. And the need, I've worked and partnered with Minneapolis Public Schools for years, trying to get services into the schools and trying to get more help for kids. And I see all the barriers very clearly. And I think one of the things that we've been able to do really well is we have an entire Native staff of providers. And so bringing in that cultural wisdom and that cultural responsive care, I think is really, we've been able to see some really amazing outcomes in a short amount of time. But we've also been able to bring some creativity to solving how do we gain access to children, because I think we've been doing things the same way for many years, and there just hasn't been enough interest in changing things up so that we're better meeting our children's needs. Thank you.
Sonia Emmerich.
Yeah, I think that we have, both in terms of practice and in terms of policy, a situation where we punish or criminalize symptoms of trauma in our kids. And I think that, you know, we have this situation now where so many of our kids are telling us so clearly, right, and persistently that they're experiencing trauma. And when we think about, right, like, what do we think about as symptoms of trauma? Think about that sleep disruptions are a symptom of trauma. And think about how tired our high school kids have been telling us they are, right? Like, when we are hearing, right, we are not gonna hear from our kids, I'm experiencing some mental health symptoms. This is what they are, like, based on DSM criteria. That's not the communication that we're gonna get. We're gonna get, I'm tired, I can't do it, I don't want to, right? We're gonna get this like low-level resistance, and we need to believe our kids and help them get that message across and get that addressed. Like, can we have staffed respite spaces in our high schools for our kids who are tired because they're traumatized? And can we understand that ringing bells or fast transitions can be trauma triggers for our kids, and figure out ways to work holistically with our students in ways that are less likely to trigger or worsen trauma, because it's what they need to be okay and present at school and for safety.
Lisa Shefty.
Yeah, I think access within the schools, but also like building it into part of the education. So like sometimes I'm so impressed by how emotionally intelligent my nephew is. And I like to think it comes from us, yeah, but I think a lot of it comes from what he learns at school. And because he can pinpoint his feelings, you know, and back to believing them, like we believe them. But you know, I don't talk about this often, but I took care of a relative, and she was a teenager, and she was living with me, and she went to South High too, and she was really highly like at risk, and everybody within the school helped. The social worker, NAC had a group there, Native American Community Clinic, had a mental health group within the hospital. I mean, within the schools, I used to work in a hospital, within the schools, right there within the school. And so like there was so many different advocates that I finally got aware of. But first it took me writing a scathing post on Facebook. And what I love about our community is everybody responded. They tagged the principal, they tagged the teachers. Yeah, thank you.
The next question will go to Lisa Shefty first. Multiple languages are spoken by students and families within the Minneapolis Public Schools. What are some specific ways that the school district can meet the needs of these students and families while also balancing learning objectives and budgetary constraints?
Yeah, we definitely need more interpreters. I know, and ESL programs, and if my only experience working with interpreters came from the hospital, and what we always talked about was the disparity of making the kids the interpreters for the family. And I think that it's interesting to me too that this question is framed from a budget, because it always seems as though from me, it's about an investment. It's an investment into the families to make sure that their students and their students are supported and have what they need in order to excel. And so with budget, considering budget, they need more. Their families need more of an investment into their solutions. Thank you.
Laurel Myra.
That's a good question. And I don't know that I have a great answer for that. I think that it's definitely an issue, that there's not enough support, there's not enough dollars to go around. And I agree that taking an approach of an investment makes sense. So I would second that. But I think trying to identify resources and more dollars, I think would be really important to fill that gap.
Sonia Emmerich.
Yeah, again, I talk to folks in the community all the time, and so like, I always pull from those conversations. So I was just recently talking with someone who said, you know, I used to have a parent support group that was kind of white, middle-class ladies, right? And there was a lot of questions about how do we get more different types of folks to the table. And she said, at some point I realized I was asking the wrong question, right? I was asking, how can I get other folks to come and do my thing with me, instead of asking myself, like, what is important to folks in different communities, right? How can I help them with what they're working on, with what's important to them? And I think that that's like a very, very big, simple, but big, complex difference. I think, you know, I think that we do try really hard in MPS, and I also do think that we are working in a public school system that is a white supremacist institution, right? Like, I can be real about that. I hope we can be real about that, and that we always need to be asking, are we trying to figure out ways to help other folks come and participate in this white supremacist culture, right? Because hopefully there's going to be some barriers to that, as opposed to asking, like, what are the priorities of the different folks that we're hoping to better partner with, and like, how can we divest from white supremacy culture to help with that? So that's what I would say.
The next question will go to Sonia Emmerich first. As a school board member, how would you respond to parents' concerns about what is being taught in classrooms? What is the school board's role in determining curriculum?
Gosh, so that's like, as a queer and transgender person, that's almost like a dog whistle question to me, right? Because like, I want to hear it through like a curriculum lens, like, how do we make sure we have a really high quality curriculum? And it's really hard for me not to hear it as like, you know, how do we keep critical race theory out of our classrooms? Or how do we keep curriculum that supports, you know, queer and trans and gender expansive kids out of our classrooms, right? So I, as a representative of a really targeted community, a community that's really being targeted through infiltrations of our school boards, even in some places in Minnesota right now, I need to say that when it comes to making sure that all of our kids are culturally affirmed, that their identities are affirmed and they're being kept safe, that has to be a priority of a school board, right? That's different than exactly which numeracy curriculum should we be using. That is fundamentally keeping all of the human beings that we are entrusted to safe and affirmed in their identities and who they are. So whether that was the intent of the question, I would be remiss if I didn't take the opportunity to say that that is 100% on the Board of Education, and it's 100% something that I would be dedicated to philosophically and quite personally.
Lisa Shefty.
Will you repeat the question, please?
As a school board member, how would you respond to parents' concerns about what is being taught in classrooms? What is the school board's role in determining curriculum?
I think the school board's role is that they should be they should be pushing and advocating for towards equity and an anti-racism strategic plan. And I think that what is taught is definitely important, and how it's taught, and then also that folks have access, like I said, like I went to the African American Leadership Forum a few years ago, and one of the women, she wrote a book. I think the book was called Black Lives Matter, and it was written for elementary students. And one of the things that she had said, and I wish I had her name so I could repeat it for you all, but one of the things she said is she was a professor in college, and most of the kids who got to college didn't have access to race or critical race or like any sort of conversation about history, real history about how the United States was formed or the relationships with other governments. And it wasn't until they got to college. That's a lot of schooling and a lot of time, because guess what? Our kids are talking about race. My kids are.
Laurel Myra.
I think what comes to mind, and I know that that's a loaded question, and I don't know that I know what's all loaded behind it. But I think for me, what comes to mind first is the importance of centering cultural responsivity in the classroom. So making sure that the needs of the kids are and the backgrounds of the kids and how the kids are the kids that are represented in the classroom, that there's books and that there's curriculum that are helping the kids to feel proud and to understand each other. So I think that's the approach that I would take, is cultural responsivity.
The next question will go to Laurel Myra first. What actions would you support be taken by the school board to increase safety in our schools? And what role should school resource officers have in Minneapolis public schools?
Oh, okay. So I guess what comes to mind for me is, what is the role of a school resource officer? I think my kind of concern comes up when I hear this question is really around how do we protect students and make sure that students aren't being targeted because of their race. I know that we do see a lot higher behavioral reports and things on kids that are kids of color or BIPOC students, and also students where there's a racial mismatch between the teacher and the student. So I don't exactly know what the question is getting at per se, but I would definitely say that I would advocate for for where schools don't necessarily, and I'll just put it out there, that there's not a police presence in the schools.
Sonia Emmerich.
Yeah, this is one that I always want to be really clear on. I do not want Minneapolis Public Schools to have a relationship with the Minneapolis Police Department. I do not want police in our schools. I do not want SROs in our schools. I understand that there are very real safety risks, and I understand that those risks are not experienced proportionately across the city in the same way. So I think that we are in a place in Minneapolis right now where there is so much community wisdom, knowledge, and energy to create mechanisms to keep ourselves and our communities safe that do not need to rely on policing in the way we historically have. And as a parent of a child who is autistic, intellectually disabled, and non-speaking, who is extremely vulnerable to poor interactions with the police, despite the fact that he's white. So same kid, if he was also a kid of color, it would be one of the most vulnerable kids in our city. I don't want police anywhere near my kid. I know that we can create conditions that address some of the things that we view as behavioral disruptions among our students by addressing things like trauma, by addressing things like systemic oppression, by addressing things like resource scarcity and the feeling of scarcity in their bodies. I know because I have done it with my own kid, and I know that we can do it for our students, and police are not the answer to me.
Lisa Shefty.
So where I go is when I hear that question, and it is a loaded question, you know, no pun intended, you know, please, whatever. Okay, I go to the idea of like safety. What are we safe from? Who's safe? Who are we keeping who safe? What are we keeping them safe from? Because I think we have this conversation in community all the time, and I'm real clear about who I'm trying to keep safe from, and it's not maybe what the rest of the school board might be. So I think getting real clear on what are we trying to keep, who are we trying to keep safe, and who are we trying to keep them safe from? And then we need to really look at the fact that the word safety is a really coded word for a lot of racism. And again, I would never, ever, ever support Minneapolis police officers in our schools at all. I would never support that. And again, I would go back to wanting to ask questions, and I feel like there's questions that we probably don't even have, but I would want to know what the students think and what the students feel about safety and have them answer some of these questions. Thank you.
We've got time for one last question, and then we'll have your closing statements. And let's start with Sonia Emmerich on this one. How would you define an excellent education?
Gosh, I can feel it before I can put words on it, right? Because for me, it's something embodied. Like I can start to feel something loosen in my body when I think of what that is. So I think about how education should feel powerful and stunning and wondrous, right? I want so much for our kids to have something going on where they can't wait for it, right? Where they are so excited. Learning should feel like thrilling. I'm sure everyone in this room has had the experience of learning something, whether it is a skill, whether it is a sport, whether it is an informational subject, learning to do something or knowing something new, and it makes you feel more in your place in the world, right? Like it's both grounding and soaring at the same time. Like I think sometimes that our expectations are too low, what we expect from our students, but also what we expect from our system, right? This is our time for our kids to come into themselves and learn who they are in the world and what all is out there for them to interact with. It should be thrilling. It shouldn't be adequate. It should be thrilling for everybody involved.
Lisa Shefty.
In high school, I used to skip class and go to the library within the school, and I was reading the Malcolm X autobiography. And I can't remember why I couldn't check it out. I'm always in trouble, I think. Didn't have a good, I don't know. But either way, I remember, you know, I didn't have access to books like Malcolm X autobiography or Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. I didn't have access to these type of books until college. And I remember in the 10th grade, I got in a lot of trouble, and I had a lot of support at school. My Cece Sadler, she was my 9th grade English teacher, and she became administration by the time I was in 11th or 12th grade, and she changed my life. Like, she made sure that folks came and paid attention to what I was doing, even if I was messing up, and asked me questions about that or things like that. So for the best education, like, I don't feel like I really learned until I got to college, and I think that's a mistake, because I think that there was a lot of opportunity, and I did have access to it at school because of teachers who gave me that extra attention, or like were invested, because then I got to go into classrooms where I excelled, and they took me from classrooms that were failing and brought me to classrooms that were excelling.
Laurel Myra.
I think this is a great question. I really appreciate you guys' responses. And I think I would just add that from kind of a personal experience, having my ex-husband lives in Matamidi, and I live in South Minneapolis. So trying to decide where our kids were going to school was really a challenge, especially when they outperform us so high in test scores and things like that. But I think what really makes an excellent school is when there's people who really care, who are at the school and who work there and who show up every day to help meet the unique and individual needs of each student. I think, when we talk about these large class sizes and some of the challenges that we see with the gaps in education, I think it really does come down to not enough resources in Minneapolis public schools. So I think that would be something that I would really push for, is to get more resources in so that we don't need to have such huge classes and for our kids to suffer with lack of resources.
Thank you, candidates. You will now have up to 1 minute for your closing statement, and we will begin with Lisa Shefty.
1 minute goes so quick. I like what you said, Laurel. It makes me think about the lack of resources, and I think one thing that doesn't come up when we have these conversations is how in the future there's going to be a disparity in and how our kids access technology, and we've seen that with with the pandemic and folks had to do distance learning, how hard it was to get our community connected online. And I think that when I think back on my access to computers and my access to technology, I didn't have my first email account until college. And so I think that I want to make sure that we're talking about also access for technology for kids so that there isn't a future disparity. Thank you, Miigwech. This was fun with you guys.
Laurel Myra.
I would just like to say thank you to you all and for having us and allowing us to share what's important to us and our priorities. I've had an opportunity to share, I think, a little bit about each of the areas that are really important to me. Children's mental health, closing the gap on education, and using a racial equity framework for each of the different policies and conversations that we have and to improve our schools. Thank you.
Sonia Emmerich.
Yeah, I'm gonna spend my 60 seconds to do a thank you. I had a lot of risk factors when I was a high school student in Minneapolis public schools, and there was a social worker at South High School who invested in helping me figure out how I could tell if I was in right relationship with myself, with the folks around me, with what I wanted to be doing. And that person is still a social worker at South High today, 24 years later. And her name is Sherry Harris. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if she will see this at any time, but I owe my life to her. And I think that we need never to forget that the folks who are interacting with our kids are having lifelong impacts on who they can be, who they will be, and most importantly, who they believe themselves to be.
Mm-hmm.
On behalf of the League of Women Voters of Minneapolis and Advancing Equity Coalition, I thank the candidates for Minneapolis School Board for being part of the democratic process by running for office and for being willing to serve our community. We hope the forum has helped voters to make an informed decision. There is never enough time to cover all the issues. If you feel that your question was not addressed, please contact the candidate directly after the forum. Many thanks to MCN6 for recording this forum and to Urban Research and Outreach Engagement Center for providing space. The studio and video recording of this forum will be available unedited for viewing on the League of Women Voters Minneapolis website lwvmpls.org, and other sources. Early voting is now open at your city hall and other early voting centers during regular business hours until November 7th. Minneapolis has added some additional early voting locations, 3 locations that will open November 1st, and 1 is right across the street at Urban League Twin Cities from where we are right now. Election Day is November 8th. You may also request and vote by absentee ballot. In Minneapolis, your ballot will include U.S. Representative, Governor and Lieutenant Governor, Secretary of State, Attorney General, County Attorney, County Sheriff, County Commissioners, Minnesota State Senate and Representative, and this school board race. To check if you are registered to vote, to register to vote, or check your polling place, or apply for an absentee ballot, visit mnvotes.org or vote411.org. That is a League of Women Voters site, and it also has candidate responses to questions and links to other candidate forums. Another reminder, the general election is on November 8th, and you need to vote. It really counts. Thank you.
Thinking that. I was like, that would be so nice. Like, if we could all get on.